This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this talk I'd like to provide students with some help studying Chapter 3 of Aristotle's Categories, another one of the most important lessons in all of classical education. We're getting ready to begin the study of Chapter 3, and so far in the first two chapters we've learned some important ideas. And I always tell students that as you learn these ideas, even in these opening chapters of Aristotle's Categories, you quickly rise to new levels of intellectual understanding that is very rare in modern society. And it just goes one chapter after another, and if you can carefully study and understand what Aristotle's explaining in these lessons, because remember, he's the master of the art of reasoning. He's the one who established the art of reasoning, at least our understanding of the art of reasoning, and he's also the one who taught it. Each time we understand a new set of concepts introduced by Aristotle, we enter into a new level of understanding that separates us from other people in the world and unites us to the wise men and saints who have studied these things and understood them in centuries past. That's one of the exciting things, I think one of the motivating things and satisfying things of these studies. I like to think about the fact that I'm growing closer and closer, or more and more like-minded to many of history's wisest and holiest men as I study these lessons. In the first chapter, Aristotle introduced us to the important differences between words that are used in our speaking. He explained that there are three different kinds of, I guess we should say, relationships between words. Words can be homonymous, synonymous, or paronymous. And you have to make sure you keep reviewing past lessons to keep those lessons in mind as you move forward into new lessons, because this art just builds and builds one lesson at a time. He explained that homonymous terms are terms that share the same name, but they have different meanings. The words are used in different senses, or the words can be used incorrectly. Someone can use the same name with different meanings because he really doesn't understand the meaning of that name as it's established by convention, that is, by human agreement on the meanings of words, which is what the purpose of a dictionary is. And you'll hear people do this all the time. They'll use a word, and it's clear, if you think of the context, that they don't understand what that word actually means. And that's a cause of confusion. Sometimes we do know the meanings of the words, but we just carelessly use them in different senses. And when we do so, those terms, even though the names are the same, are homonymous because the meanings that they signify are not the same. And then synonymous terms are terms which agree both in name and in meaning. They have exactly the same meaning, the same name. The names are used in the same sense, and therefore they can be considered to be equivalent terms. And this is going to be important as we get into reasoning. And then thirdly, paronymous terms, which are terms that appear to be the same, but really are only similar. Aristotle explains that they're names that differ in case, or they come from the same source, but maybe they have some difference in their form and consequently in their meaning. So we've got these three relationships between terms. Terms can be homonymous, synonymous and paronymous. And in reasoning, obviously, it's important that we make sure that when we use a word or words, we use them synonymously. So that was the important lesson of chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, we looked at the 4 different kinds of simple ideas. And I explained that simple ideas are the subject of the categories. Aristotle said there's 2 different ways that we can speak. We can speak with ideas being connected in speech. And I said we'll learn about that later in reasoning in the second book on interpretation. Or we can speak about things in a way where they're not connected, just simple ideas. And this is the subject of the categories. And Aristotle divided simple ideas into 4 different classes. And we talked about that in chapter 2. And again, make sure you're reviewing past lessons to keep these things clear. Sometimes you just have to keep chewing on them, and then move on to a new lesson, and something you learn in the new lesson will enlighten something you didn't grasp in the previous lesson. So you've got to simultaneously keep moving forward and keep going back and reviewing. So let's get started with chapter 3 here. A very important chapter that really reveals to us what it means to reason, what reasoning actually is. Aristotle begins chapter 3 and says the following. He says, "When one thing is predicated of another as of a subject," so get that idea in mind. When one thing is predicated of another thing as of a subject, as many things as are asserted of that which is predicated, so many may also be asserted of the subject. This sentence here at the beginning of chapter 3 is really the essence of reasoning. This is the great breakthrough that Aristotle made. It seems so simple once we understand this. It seems so simple, and yet it's so profound. This is Aristotle's great discovery, which grows into his entire work on reasoning, and which establishes as his method all of the philosophical sciences. This may be the most important sentence we study anywhere in any of our classical studies. When one thing is predicated of another as of a subject, as many things as are asserted of that which is predicated, so many may also be asserted of the subject. So let's unpack this a little bit. And again, stay close to Aristotle's text. Don't start reading articles and books and watching videos. And as soon as you start moving away from the text, it's like playing the game Operator, where one person tells a message to this next person, and then that person tells another person, and it goes on, and by the time they're down the line, the message has changed 10 times, and it just slowly falls apart. The same thing happens when we study and move away from the master text. So let's make sure our eyes and thoughts are always focused on the text. Let's get this idea, though, that Aristotle is teaching clear in our minds. And let's do so with an example. And he's going to give us an example, but let's just get right into it and make this simple, because it is simple. Profound, yet simple. He begins by saying, when one thing is predicated of another as of a subject. So if I say, Socrates is a man, Socrates is a man. Something is predicated of another thing as of a subject. Man is being predicated of Socrates. Socrates is a man. Man is being predicated or asserted of Socrates. Then he says, as many things as are asserted of that which is predicated. So anything that can be asserted of man, anything that can be asserted of man may also be asserted of the original subject, Socrates. So if man can be asserted of Socrates, anything that can be asserted of man can be asserted of Socrates. So if I say Socrates is a man, and I say all men are mortal, then I can say Socrates is mortal. If I say all men are rational, then I can say Socrates is rational. Anything that I can assert truly about the predicate, I can also assert truly about the subject, the original subject. That is the concept of reasoning. Anything that I can assert about something that can be asserted about something else, I can assert about that first subject. So we see this relationship where there's three terms that have a relationship. There's the first term, which is the original subject. Then there's the second term, which is the original predicate. And then there's another predicate, which is predicated of that predicate. So we see this relationship between three terms. And this relationship between three terms is the operation of reasoning, as we're going to see as we continue to unfold this and learn more and more about how our souls actually are designed by God to work. This is what makes us human. This is what it means to be human. The nature of a thing is known by its operation, by what it does. And this operation of reasoning is what distinguishes man from every other creature. This is what makes man man, that his soul does this simple process. And yet this simple process is the source of the greatest philosophical, even theological learning. This simple, natural process that God has put in our soul. It's what makes us human. It's what makes us the greatest of all living creatures. This simple yet powerful faculty of reasoning. Let's continue. Let me just read that sentence one more time and then we'll move on. And Aristotle is going to give us the example. When one thing is predicated of another, as of a subject, as many things as are asserted of that which was predicated, so many also may be asserted of the subject. Thus, Aristotle says, man is predicated of a certain man. Remember what certain man means. It means an individual man. A man we can name, we can point to and name that man, like Socrates. Man is predicated of a certain man, an individual man. But animal is predicated of man. So here we have these three terms. We have this individual man, which is the original subject. We have man, which is the predicate of that first sentence or judgment. And then we have animal, which is predicated of man. So we've got these three terms. Animal since it's predicated of man, and man is predicated of a certain man, animal can then be truly asserted of that certain man. And I gave you an example of this before. Again, a very simple concept. And yet this is the key to all reasoning. Really, all that Aristotle is going to explain for us in the other works of the Organon are simply the implications of this simple reality. If we just think about all of the consequences that flow from this simple concept, it would lead us to Aristotle's works on reasoning. And we're going to see that Aristotle is simply going to reflect on this and allow it to unfold and lead us into the beautiful art of reasoning. He goes on to explain, for a certain man, and this individual man, is both man and animal. An individual man is both man and animal. And I think you can get that clearly in your mind as we move forward, because we're about to get into something that's a little more challenging. I'm going to read this next sentence from beginning to end, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. A very important sentence. Aristotle writes, "Of things heterogeneous and which are not arranged under each other, the differences are also different in species." I'll read that one more time. Of things heterogeneous and which are not arranged under each other, the differences are also different in species. What in the world is Aristotle talking about there? Now, this is where, throughout history, men struggled to understand Aristotle's teaching. This is also where Porphyry, in the introduction, which you should have studied if you're studying the categories, Porphyry explained the ideas that lie behind what Aristotle is explaining here. You won't notice it, though, if you just read this English translation. For a certain man is both man and animal, of things heterogeneous, and which are not arranged under each other, the differences are also different in species. Now, if you didn't read Porphyry, you have no idea what Aristotle is talking about here. But this is the system of ideas in Aristotle's mind that Porphyry introduces us to in his introduction. What were the 5 things that we said were necessary to understand in order to read Aristotle's categories? There were 5 things that Porphyry identified. If you don't remember them, you need to spend more time going back and reviewing, because these are important as we move forward. And here you can see that knowledge, if it was on the tip of your tongue, would be able to help you through this passage. The 5 things that Porphyry said we need to understand are genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident. Those 5 things, the meanings of those 5 terms, Porphyry said were necessary for us to make good progress in understanding the categories of Aristotle. And here you see where we run into our first little trouble. Of things heterogeneous. What does that mean? Well, let's start by making sure we remember what Aristotle means by things, of things. This is the art of reasoning. We're not talking about things in the physical world, things that move and change, things that have bodies and are material, things we can perceive with our senses. That's not what we're talking about here in the categories. We're talking about things of which we speak. We're talking about ideas. Of things heterogeneous. What in the world does this word heterogeneous mean? Well, it's a word that's composed of two parts, hetero and geneous. Hetero means different. Hetero means different. So if I say that a person is heterosexual, it means that he has relations with someone of the opposite or other sex. He's normal, heterosexual. Heterogeneous means that two or more things belong to different genera. And remember that genera is the plural form of genus. So if one thing belongs to a genus and a second thing belongs to a different genus, they don't belong to the same genus. They are heterogeneous. And if two things do belong to the same genus, they're homogeneous. So we've got homogeneous of the same genus and heterogeneous of different genera or of two different genuses. But the proper plural form is genera. So Aristotle says, of things heterogeneous, of things which belong to different genera, which are not arranged under each other. What in the world does that mean? Which are not arranged under each other. Well, what he's referring to here is what we talked about, again, in Porphyry, when we learned about the tree of Porphyry, or the Porphyrian tree. We explained how you start at the most general genus, and then it divides into species, and then that species becomes a genus for the things that are under it. So you see what we're referring to when we say that this is under that or this is over that. So when Aristotle says, of things heterogeneous, of ideas that belong to different genera and which are not arranged under each other, that is, in the same tree, as it were, in the same line, from that most general genus down to the most special species. And again, if you're unfamiliar with this stuff that I'm talking about, maybe you're just listening to this video by itself on YouTube, you need to study Porphyry's introduction, where these ideas are explained. That's the purpose of that book. Of things that are heterogeneous, that belong to different genera, and which are not arranged under each other, the differences between them are also different in species. So they don't share the same differences. Remember, Porphyry taught us genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident need to be understood before we can understand Aristotle. Here we see Aristotle getting into these ideas, and it's like assumed knowledge. This is part of Aristotle's obscurity. He assumes that his students, or those reading these books, have a knowledge of some preliminary ideas. And most students don't have this knowledge, which is why reading Aristotle can be so difficult. Porphyry already helped us out quite a bit. So if there are things which belong to different genera, they're not arranged under each other, the differences that divide those genera into species, the differences that those things have are going to be different. They're going to be different kinds of differences. And again, if you studied porphyry, you know what differences and species and genera are. And then, as I said in the last lesson, Aristotle moves from this lesson into examples. And I explained that usually to understand Aristotle's teaching, it's more helpful to look at his examples than his explanations because he's intentionally obscure. He says, for instance, the differences of animal and science. The differences of animal and science. And remember, differences are things which divide a class into its species. So what are some of the differences of animal? Well, he lists some. Pedestrious, biped, winged, and aquatic. So those are some examples of the differences of animal. And he says the other thing that he's thinking of is science. And because science does not belong to the same genus as animal, nor is it under animal, nor animal under science, but they belong to separate trees, as it were. Their differences also will be different. They'll be of different kinds or species. The differences of animal are pedestrious. Some animals are pedestrious. Some animals are not pedestrious. Some animals are biped or two-footed. Some animals are winged. Some animals are aquatic. No one of these differences is a difference of science. So the differences are unique to these different things because they're heterogeneous and neither is arranged under the other. Aristotle goes on to say science does not differ from science in being a biped. That which divides science into different kinds of science is not the same as that which divides animal into different kinds or species of animal. And then Aristotle says, of the subaltern genera, however, and again, if you haven't studied porphyry, you're going to have no idea what subaltern genera are. But this is what Porphyry explained in the introduction. Of subaltern genera. Now, one of the important lessons that you're going to have to learn if you're going to make any progress in studies is you're going to have to learn to understand vocabulary in context, based on what you read. You can't look up every word. You can't go on rabbit trails all through different books and works trying to figure out what words and phrases mean. You certainly can't Google things. You're not going to get accurate philosophical definitions by Googling or by using ChatGPT or something like that. You can learn that the hard way, but it's not going to work. The only way to really understand the meaning of terms is to see how they're used in context and to pay attention to them as you continue to read and study, because you'll see them in more and more places, and you'll begin to fine-tune the meaning of these different terms. So don't just quit. Don't just throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, I don't know that word. I never saw it before. You can figure it out by using the context to understand what this term or phrase must mean or might mean. So let's just look and see what we could figure out. We see of the subaltern genera, however. However here is a clue that shows us what this term means. It means something different than whatever was spoken of before. Before, Aristotle was speaking of things heterogeneous, things that belong to different genera. So if subaltern genera is something different from heterogeneous, we can take a reasonable guess and say that subaltern genera must be things that are homogeneous or that are arranged under one another, since that's the opposite of what he was speaking of before. And that is in fact what it means. Subaltern genera are genera that are aligned under one another. Remember, Porphyry talked about the media, the different arrangement of genus and species from top to bottom. He said the most general genus was at the top, and the most special species was at the bottom, and then the most special species contained just individual things at the bottom, primary substances. So we've got that arrangement, and there's that chain of genus and species from top to bottom. And the classes of things that were found along that chain, arranged above and beneath one another, were called subaltern genera. Subaltern. They were referred to as the media, or the things in the middle between the most general genus and the most special species. And again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't think that you're dumb or something. This is all explained in Porphyry's introduction, which students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy should have studied before getting into this lesson on the categories. So now Aristotle's talking about the subaltern genera. Of subaltern genera, nothing hinders, but there may be the same differences between different things. For the superior are predicated of the genera which are under them. Hence, as many differences as there are of that which is predicated, so many also will there be of the subject. So this relates back to that original sentence about reasoning. As many differences as there are of that which is predicated, so many will there be of the subject. And remember, differences are attributes that divide a class of things into species or subordinate classes of things. As many differences as there are of that which is predicated, so many also will there be of the subject. And that brings us to the end of chapter 3. And again, this is intended just to be help for your first reading of these chapters. You've now got the task to study this chapter for mastery. And as a student, which means one who is seeking, you've got to study to understand what Aristotle is teaching in this chapter, and you've also got to ask questions. And to be a good tutor, I've got to always force students to take initiative. And so if there's anything in this chapter that you find yourself not able to understand, and again, that's assuming you're trying your best to understand it, post those questions that you have on the student forum, on the course page in the study center. But work through this chapter here. Use what you've learned already in Porphyry's introduction and in chapters 1 and 2 of the categories to understand as much as you can. And when you feel comfortable that you understand each sentence and what it means, then complete the lesson assessment so that you can move on to the next chapter. And remember, often when we move on to a new chapter and continue through our studies, much of what we learn in chapters that follow help us to understand more clearly chapters we've studied previously. So you should constantly be cycling through your studies, not just one chapter to previous chapters, but one book to previous books, one one subject or course to previous subjects and courses. That's one of the reasons why teaching and tutoring other younger or less advanced students is so helpful for your own learning, is that it helps you to stay in this constant environment of cycling back through past lessons as you move forward into new lessons. It's a very important part of the study process. But if there's anything in here that you need help with, feel free to post questions on the student forum on the course pages, and I'll answer them there in as much detail as I can. And if you come up with a question that I can't answer, I'll dig a little bit to try and help you find an answer to those questions. But that's all for Chapter 3 of the categories. It's time for you now to study this chapter for mastery, get the assessment done, and we'll move on together in the study of Aristotle's categories through Classical Reasoning 1. God bless.